In 1967, two men wrote a book that stopped to name a distinction. They built the case like accountants. First, a bombed black church, dead children, an act that already had a word waiting for it. Then, in that same city, Birmingham, Alabama, a second set of dead that they describe, and that drew nothing like the same condemnation. Here's how they wrote that second one. Carmichael and Hamilton wrote, quote, 500 black babies die each year because of the lack of proper food, shelter, and medical facilities. And thousands more are destroyed and maimed physically, emotionally, and intellectually. End quote. That second toll, they say, is the institutional kind. Those figures are theirs, and the argument does not stand on the arithmetic. It stands on the gap. One set of deaths had a word. The other had to be argued into having one. The authors are Stokely Carmichael, who later took the name Kwame Ture, and Charles Hamilton. And this is not only a fact about 1967. It changes how we read the story we inherit about what racism is. The explanation that can feel sufficient, that racism is something certain people feel and sometimes act on, is the exact explanation these two set out to show was covering for something bigger. Here is the stake. The phrase they built for that second half is one I hear constantly. The argument underneath it, I hear almost never. So here's the question this episode exists to answer. When the harm is real, and the author of it is nowhere to be found, who is left to answer for it? And I'll say now where this ends up, because it is the part people skip to and misread. Later in this same book, they call integration a subterfuge. Not segregation, integration. That sentence is unreadable until the rest of the argument is standing, so we build it first. Start with what the book does on its opening pages. Before they use their central word, they stop and define it. Racism, on their account, is what you get when decisions and policies are made on racial grounds in order to hold a group under and keep control of it. Read that again slowly. There is a phrase buried in it we will have to come back to. It says nothing about hatred or slurs or what is in anybody's heart. It is about decisions and policies. Institutions sit at the center of it, though individual acts remain one of its two named forms. Then they cut the thing in half. There's racism done by individual whites to individual blacks. And there's racism done by the entire white community to the entire black community. That second kind, they say, is far harder to pin on particular people doing particular things, and it draws much less public condemnation. It comes, in their words, out of how respected and established institutions ordinarily operate. And their naming sentence is 8 words long. Carmichael and Hamilton wrote, quote, "We call these individual racism and institutional racism," end quote. That's it. No headline, no chant at a rally. One sentence in chapter 1, doing the unglamorous work of labeling the half of the problem that didn't have a label. And it is where they name the distinction in this book. Now look at what they attach to the first kind, because it is the tell. That kind, they say, is the kind a television camera can record, and that can often be watched while it is being done. That's their illustration of the asymmetry, and it's a sharp one. In their Birmingham comparison, both examples involve deaths. What differs is whether the act can be observed while it happens, and therefore how the country responds to it. The half of the harm the country already knew how to condemn was the half you could point a camera at. The half they had to argue into existence was the half they locate inside the ordinary functioning of respected institutions, where no single actor is easy to point at. Then they turn the knife, and it lands on people who look like they are behaving well. Respectable people, they point out, get to clear themselves of personal blame. Bombing a church is not something they would ever do. And yet, on the author's account, those same people keep backing the officials and the institutions that carry racist policy forward. The definition of blame those individuals are using reaches only as far as the thing on television. The author's reaches further. But hold on to that phrase, for the purpose of. Their definition requires a purpose, and the obvious objection is that nobody sat down and wanted those infants dead. Hold that. It looks like a small drafting question now. By the end, it decides whether the name they gave this can still do its job. Now they escalate, and the escalation is a single word. Naming institutions as the site of the harm was step one. Step two puts a name on the relationship itself. Carmichael and Hamilton wrote, quote, "Thus institutional racism has another name, colonialism," end quote. Black Americans, they argue, hold citizenship and mostly the same rights on paper as anyone else, and they stand in the position of colonial subjects regardless. How can both of those be true at once? That question is the burden of the whole chapter, and they carry it across three domains, taking each in turn. Are they naive about this? No, and that is what makes the chapter worth reading. They raise the obvious objections themselves. They grant, in their words, that the analogy is obviously not perfect. A colony usually means a territory and a people held apart from the country that owns them. And the classic colony ships out cheap raw material, where, as they put it, Black communities in the United States export nothing but human labor. Their answer is that South Africa and Rhodesia put colonizer and colonized on the very same ground, and that a man cultivating cotton at $3 for a 10-hour day, then handing the money back for clothes and food sold to him by white manufacturers, stands in a structurally similar position, whatever the map says. That last step is their claim, and it is the one doing the most work. And then comes the sentence the whole analogy is standing on. It is the objective relationship which counts, they say, not rhetoric, they say. And their South Africa and Rhodesia example is there to show that physical separation is not what settles it. That is a real move, and it is the thinnest moment in the chapter. When you have hold your own analogy twice, insisting on the objective relationship is closer to a decision than an argument. That seam is where I would press hardest. So watch what they do next and judge whether it answers the objection or steps around it. They stop arguing by analogy and start arguing by mechanism. The mechanism has a name: indirect rule. The sources they lean on for it are named ones. They cite Martin Kilson on Sierra Leone, describing colonial administration run through chiefs who exercise executive authority, a system they call colonialism on the cheap. They cite Kwame Nkrumah on West Africa, on chiefs propped up by the colonial government until they became inefficient and unpopular, and on warrant chiefs in East Africa, tied so tightly to the colonial power that plenty of Africans came to believe chiefs were a British invention. Then they set an American case beside it. Congressman William Dawson of the largely Black 1st District on the south side of Chicago. Before he was co-opted, they write, he spoke out for the race without hedging. Afterward, in their words, he served the downtown white Democratic power structure. And they cite Charles Silberman on what the trade actually bought. Jobs, the low-paid kind, handed out to a lot of followers. Someone to call when the police or a bail bondsman or a housing official became a problem. A cut of the city's spending, which Silberman calls a slice of the melon. Set against that, on Silberman's reckoning, went his community's pride and his dignity, and any chance of making the city's political and civic leadership actually confront segregation and oppression. That is their case, and you should weigh it as their case. But notice what it costs them. If the arrangement runs on intermediaries drawn from the community itself, the book has just pointed at someone who looks nothing like a colonial officer. It is pointed at a black congressman. Which raises a harder question, and they walk straight into it. Who else is on that payroll? Their answer is the least flattering one available, because it reaches the people best equipped to end the thing. They call them captive leaders. Not sellouts in the cheap sense, school teachers, county agents, junior executives, the professional class, which is to say, the people whose voices would carry. What the cited finding supports is narrower. That dependence restricts what they can do. The stronger version, that the structure need not silence them because it employs them, is my reading of where that goes. Their evidence is specific, and they source it. From Professor Daniel C. Thompson's study, they take a finding about New Orleans. Public school teachers were the biggest professional bloc in that city's black community, 1,600 strong in 1961. And Thompson's read, as they reported, is that because those teachers drew their pay at the discretion of white officials, how far they could lead was sharply bounded, and lining up publicly with racial uplift work had become close to impossible. Then there's the most efficient sentence in the chapter, and it isn't theirs. They take it from John A. Williams, who went to interview a professor at a black college in Alabama. The professor's answer, as Williams reports it, came down to this. The governor of Alabama signed his paycheck, and so he had nothing whatever to say. The sentence does not tell you the man approves of anything. It tells you what his salary is doing to what he can say. And out of that, the authors draw a conclusion I find genuinely hard to sit with. Carmichael and Hamilton wrote, quote, "It may well be, and we think it is, that leadership and security are basically incompatible," end quote. I keep circling back to that one. It says that if the arrangement you claim to be fighting is also paying you, it has already priced you in. It says your comfort is evidence, which is not a thing many people can hear about themselves. That's a hard doctrine, and I'll say plainly where it fails. It's close to unfalsifiable. There is a test in here, of a coarse kind. Dependence on white officials, employment you can lose. But it only runs one way. It can tell you who is constrained, and it cannot tell the constrained insider apart from the one who is actually moving something. But strip out the overreach, and something real is left, and it's a question about direction. Not whether a person is inside an institution, but which way their dependence runs. And notice that twice now, faced with a question about power, this book has answered by fixing a word to it: colonialism, captive. That is not decoration, it is the method. And Chapter 2 finally says so. It opens by asking who gets to decide what a thing is called, and the word it puts on trial is integration. Chapter 2 opens somewhere you would not expect a book about power to open, on vocabulary. The claim is that before you take anything else, somebody has to take the right to say what things are called, and that this is not preliminary to the fight, it is the fight. Carmichael and Hamilton wrote, quote, "Those who have the right to define are the masters of the situation," end quote. And they run a list to prove it. In their telling, when the cavalry won, it went into the record as a victory. And when the other side won, it went in as a massacre. The colonists, they note, called their fight against England a revolution, while the English reached for words like insubordination and riot to bring it down a peg. The period after Reconstruction in the South has been called, they note, by many historians the period of redemption, a label that quietly asserts something good was rescued from something bad. And against that label, They invoke John Hope Franklin and W.E.B. Du Bois. Same events, opposite words. The words are what got taught. Their sharpest illustration is a children's book. They reach for the exchange from Lewis Carroll, where Humpty Dumpty announces a word means just what he chooses it to mean. Alice objects that you can't make words mean so many different things, and Humpty Dumpty tells her, the only question is, which is to be master? Think about that choice. A book about political domination, and the load-bearing citation is a nursery argument between a girl and an egg. It disarms first and argues second, which is why the premise gets through before anyone thinks to contest it. They apply it immediately to the word being used against them. Integration, they argue, had already been given its meaning by white America, and in that version, it was about race mixing, about black men and white daughters. For black people, they write, the word had pointed at something material instead, a route to better lives economically and politically. In their account, the other definition is the one that stuck. That is what they mean by a new consciousness. And it is why a book supposedly about seizing power spends its opening pages arguing about a dictionary. If your opponent's descriptions of you are the ones in circulation, you are fighting on ground he surveyed, which sets up the word they put on trial next. Before we get there, I want to take apart the version of this book I think most of us carry because it is about to get in the way. The story is that this is the angry one, the shout that answered the dream. In June of 1966, James Meredith set out to walk across Mississippi to encourage black people to register to vote. And on the second day, he was shot from ambush. Others took up the march. And in Greenwood, after being arrested and released, Stokely Carmichael stood in front of a crowd and told them that 6 years of saying freedom had gotten them nothing, and that what they had to start saying now was black power. That is the image. That is the picture the phrase carries. A movement out of patience. The book arrives the next year, and my honest guess is that most of us file it under the chant. Now, here's the correction, and it isn't the one you might expect. I'm not going to tell you the book isn't angry. The preface throws out the etiquette on the grounds that nobody in this situation has time for parlor games, and you can hear for yourself what temperature that is. The false move is treating angry and careful as opposites. Because look at what this book does when you actually open it. It stops and defines its terms before using them. It builds its central mechanism out of named scholars and named cases. It argues with Gunnar Myrdal. It reaches for Lewis Carroll to make a point about who controls meaning. The anger is real, and the anger is not the method. And that distinction matters right here, at this exact point, because the sentence we are about to read is not a mood. It's a conclusion. It follows from the definition in Chapter 1. You are free to reject it, but you have to reject the argument and not the volume. A group has to close ranks first, they argue, before it can enter the open society on any terms worth having. Solidarity before bargaining. And they present this as the ordinary route rather than a radical one, the path other arriving groups took by building institutions of their own before negotiating with anyone. Carmichael and Hamilton wrote, quote, "Integration is a subterfuge for the maintenance of white supremacy," end quote. That sentence travels beautifully on its own, which is exactly the problem. Because on its own, it sounds like a rejection of black and white children sitting in the same classroom. What they reject, explicitly, is a model in which a decent house or education requires moving into a white neighborhood. Whether that lands as a rejection of desegregated schooling as such is a question these pages do not separately weigh. And I want to be honest that the distinction I am about to draw is mine, not theirs. Here is their reasoning. Integration as practice, they say, rests on swallowing whole the premise that a decent house or a decent schooling has to be found inside a white neighborhood or a white school. And swallowing it teaches something in both directions. It says white is the better thing by default and black the lesser thing by definition. It lets the country, they write, fix its attention on a few Southern black children admitted to white schools at enormous cost, while the 94% left behind in unimproved all-black schools go unlooked at. That figure is theirs, and I treat it as their claim rather than a measurement. But the shape of the objection does not depend on the number. It's that a country can move a small number of individuals across a line, feel genuinely good about having done it, and leave the condition that drew the line completely intact. The exception gets celebrated. The rule doesn't move. And the strongest pushback? I think it's that they're running two different things together. There's integration as assimilation, the demand that you leave your community in order to be treated decently. And there's desegregation as access, the dismantling of legal exclusion. The critique lands hard on the first. Aimed at the second, it's setting aside real material gains without weighing them. And this chapter doesn't do that weighing. But notice that the objection does not touch the pattern they are describing, which brings us back to that objection, the one about nobody meaning it. For the purpose of, there it is again. Their definition requires a purpose, and now the objection can be tested. The cheap version says nobody intended those infant deaths, so the definition fails. I think the cheap version is wrong, and it's worth being precise about why. Here is how I would read their definition, and this is my reading rather than a distinction they spell out. A purpose does not have to sit inside one person's head. It can sit in a decision, and decisions have makers. What the definition asks for on its face is decisions and policies made on racial grounds, aimed at holding a group under and keeping control of it. So the question their definition asks is not whether somebody felt something. It is whether decisions predicated on race for that purpose can be produced. And producing them is what Chapter 1 sets out to do. They contend that the ghetto is entered from outside and bled dry by people who do not live in it. They contend that the decisions shaping black life are made elsewhere and handed down. That is their contention, argued from their examples, and you should weigh it as an argument rather than a proof. But the shape of it is clear enough. On their account, the infants sit at the end of a chain of decisions, and every link in that chain has somebody standing at it. Here's the limit, and it is a limit on reach, not a flaw in the reasoning. The test I am proposing, and it is mine rather than theirs, is whether those decisions can be produced. In the cases these chapters work with, the decisions they point to are ones they can name and cite. I suspect that is not a coincidence, though I want to flag that as my inference rather than something they argue. Hold that standard fixed and move it forward, and the burden changes completely. Where an outcome sorts by race, and every individual decision behind it is defensible on its face, the purpose is no longer lying on the surface to be quoted. It has to be inferred from the pattern. An inference is precisely what an accusation of racism is least able to survive in public. Now, I want to be careful because the passages I have in front of me are the preface and the first two chapters, and they do not tell me what these two men thought about a world where the statutes had changed. That question is not answered here. What I can say is that their definition does not exclude that world, and that nothing in these chapters is addressed to it. That gap is why the phrase can be said so easily and cached so rarely. So, who is left to answer for it? If Carmichael and Hamilton are right that this is a distinct kind of harm, then remedies aimed at hearts and attitudes will always be insufficient on their own, however sincere, because they are not aimed at the thing doing the damage. But if the standard is evidence of purpose, then wherever that evidence cannot be produced, the word makes an accusation it cannot yet support, and everyone reaching for it inherits that weakness. That is the break, not the failure of a bad argument. What happens to a good one when the thing it described stops announcing itself? In this book, they gave that half of the harm a name. The harder half they left to us. Not what to call it, how to prove it.